The barrier to the northwest, the Ohio River. Crossing this river marked a milestone in a movement within the U.S. to end slavery, but it really started long before that with the Revolutionary War. Though many remarkable men participated in this war, two in particular stand out. These two men were Rufus Putnam and Manasseh Cutler. When America won their independence in the Ohio Territory, they promised many of the veterans of this war land in their new addition to the United States. Rufus Putnam, one of the officers promised land there, decided he would start a company to begin the real settling of the Northwest Territory. Manasseh Cutler was asked to join Rufus Putnam and several other men to discuss the formation of what would be called the Ohio Company. It was decided that Manasseh would travel down to Philadelphia and discuss with the Founding Fathers how they would go about settling Ohio. Manasseh was able to successfully contribute to the creation of the Northwest Ordinance, a document that changed our country in the course of history. It decreed how new states would be formed in the territories, how the settling of a new territory would take place, and open up the way for new states in the future. Most importantly, it contained a clause that Manasseh fought so hard to have included, a clause that set the stage for an even tougher challenge, the fight to abolish slavery in the U.S. This clause stated that slavery would not be allowed in any of the territory from then on. There were several first drafts of the ordinance, but none of them meant what Manasseh was seeking. One, the Jefferson Plan, was to have slavery banned after the year 1800, but by then the settlers there would be used to slavery and not want to give it up. At first, this Jeffersonian ordinance was approved in 1774. Manasseh knew that it did not agree with the Ohio Company's plans and, of course, allowed slavery, which they knew would potentially create slave states. However, after arguing and pushing their point, they were able to bring some to their point of view. Though it is not fully clear on how this happened and who was responsible, we now believe it was mostly the effort of Manasseh, as he even wrote the clause to ban slavery. The clause states, there shall be neither slavery nor involuntary servitude in the said territory, otherwise than in the punishment of crimes whereof the parties shall have been duly convicted. Despite all of his great contributions to the territory, Manasseh would never actually live there and only visited a few times, usually to see his son Ephraim. This son of his carried on his legacy of fighting against slavery, because just 14 years after the Northwest Ordinance was passed in 1778, Ephraim would fight and win to make Ohio the first free state. The Ohio River may not seem like a barrier to some, but it marked the beginning of hundreds and thousands of new lives just about to begin. This barrier represented freedom for African Americans, and it represented the accomplishments of the colors and what they did for every settler who made that journey. However, this idea of freedom from slavery may have ended with the founding of a new state, Ohio, if it wasn't for Ephraim Cutler. Ephraim arrived several years after the first settlers, but he became a highly respected judge of the territory. Ephraim lived a fairly normal life in the territory until in the year 1802 he was asked to serve in the Constitutional Convention of Ohio. From obligation and to prevent the mistakes of his fellow politicians, Ephraim reluctantly agreed to serve in this convention and fight for his beliefs. Eventually, the topic of slavery was debated. An amazing quote from History of Washington County, Ohio reads, "There was one topic before the convention of absorbed interest. Few people of this day know how narrowly the state of Ohio escaped being made slave territory in the year 1802. The monster knocked for minutes at the door which had been closed to it by the Ordinance of 1787, and the door was even set ajar for the entrance of the colossal evil. But there were men to meet and thrust it back and close that door again and forever. Foremost among these men was Ephraim Cutler of Washington County, son of Manasseh Cutler, who had 15 years before placed in that fundamental law of the Northwest, the Ordinance of Freedom. Here was the poetry of history. One of the first proposals was that there would be no involuntary servitude for males over 21 and females over 18. In response to this, that night, Ephraim wrote up the clause that is currently in their Constitution. Ephraim was on the Bill of Rights Committee, so he was able to propose a clause for the Bill of Rights. He proposed a clause in Section 6, Article 1 of the Constitution in the Bill of Rights, which today states that there shall be no slavery in the state, nor involuntary servitude, unless for the punishment of crime. He debated his clause and was able to bring many people over to his side, as he was well respected by many of his peers and accomplished in the arts of persuasion. However, on the days when it was to be finally discussed and voted on, Ephraim fell ill. A Mrs. Dalways, most likely a direct relative of his, noted a conversation she had with Ephraim on this. Ephraim stated, "I well remember the excited feeling of General Putnam on the occasion. I had been for a day or two confined to my room by sickness, and he came to see me. His form more erect than usual. 'Cutler,' he said in a voice of thunder, 'get up and get well, and be in your place tomorrow. We must prevent this. I will not live in a community where such injustice is sanctioned by law. Putnam.' So, he rose from his sickbed and made one more speech to turn the tide. Many people commented and congratulated his ability of persuasion at this time, and his speech worked so well that he was able to convince just enough people to switch over to win the vote by one. Because of this effort, Ephraim was able to have his clause in the new Constitution, forever banning slavery in the state of Ohio. What is rarely mentioned about the banning of slavery, though, is that they still barely gave the freed African Americans any rights. They only allowed those already living there to vote and gave very little chance of rights to those being born in the future or those who would settle in Ohio. The book, The Black Laws, commented on this. The Ohio Constitution prohibited slavery, but its framers laid the cornerstone for the Black Laws by limiting voting and office holding to white males. Thus, by placing restrictions on African Americans, the first Constitution of Ohio offered more than one meaning to freedom in a state with no slavery. These facts are the other side of Ohio's new freedom, putting it into question, changing our perspective on what freedom really was in the early 1800s, even into the 1900s. Ephraim also had several children. The two to note are his son William and his daughter Julia. Julia Cutler was responsible for much of the information found today, such as preserving his journals and letters in addition to writing a book on his life, The Life and Times of Ephraim Cutler. William Cutler carried on the anti-slavery ideals of the Cutler men, as he too believed that slavery should be stopped in some way, and he even publicly spoke on his father and slavery after his death. This passing down of abolishment ideals went from Manasseh to Ephraim and on to William, and was most likely preserved in their family for several generations after, showing how important this topic was to them. Based on how much Ephraim fought slavery and the influence from his father, it is reasonable to believe that he did take some part in the Underground Railroad and the freeing of even more African Americans. There is even a possible account from one of his young daughters who thinks she saw him conducting a boat of freed slaves. Additionally, the founding of the Underground Railroad and this movement started in Ohio, as many of its early and core founders lived in Ohio, as it was the first free state. It is written in the book Beyond the River of the first abolitionists that settled there. Droves of Virginia's veteran soldiers were hastening to the land beyond the Ohio River. Colonel James Powidge was one of them. He abhorred slavery. The others came slowly, year by year. There was Alexander Campbell, who was, by most accounts, Ohio's first abolitionist. And it goes on to show how the Underground Railroad and the abolition movement formed and grew, starting with these founders. Soon after the founding of Ohio and its contributions to the Underground Railroad, the abolition movement took off. It spread through most of the northern states, caused more and more slaves to be freed, and brought lasting change to our country. And this all started with a few men wanting to make a difference, wanting to change the country for the better. People who believed in a cause and fought for it with passion. It started with the first state to break the barrier of slavery and to choose freedom, and with the founding of a movement. There's a lot of evidence to support the Cutlers' contributions, and many letters and dissertations showing their appreciation and recognition of them. When Ephraim died in 1853, newspapers, magazines, and speeches all displayed what an amazing man he was. His funeral discourse, written and read by Professor E.B. Andrews, demonstrates this perfectly in saying, "We can hardly predict what the consequences would have been had there not been a few men such as Judge Cutler to resist the insidious aggressions of the monstrous evil of slavery. And to him must ever belong the high honor of drafting that article in the first Constitution and fundamental law of the great state of Ohio, which makes it the home of the free while the state shall last." In fact, this funeral discourse in Ephraim's life were so influential that there are letters requesting a copy of it kept in the family archives, now stored at Marietta College. All of these letters, speeches, articles, etc. illustrate just how influential his and his father's actions were to this nation. Thanks to the Cutlers and those who joined the early fight against slavery, our country became the symbol it stands for: freedom.